Okay, well then, hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for what I'm sure is going to be an amazing session from our partners at CREA. Just before we jump in, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which I'm currently on in Ottawa is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I thank them for allowing me to live, work, and play on this land. Just a quick word on the tech and format for today's session before I introduce our speaker. As you can see, we're in Zoom webinar format, so if you have any questions, please type it in the chat box, and if time permits, we'll answer all questions at the end of today's Zoom. Today's session centers around the following. Canada is in the midst of an ongoing housing crisis, with homeowners and renters alike feeling the effects. Our partner, Sean Cathcart at the Canadian Real Estate Association, will be discussing the missing middle and how a lack of supply is part of what landed Canada in this crisis and how increasing supply is part of the solution. So with that, Sean, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Chloe, and thanks for having me. It's funny that, normally my audience that I speak to is realtors, and I give them the unvarnished truth about what market they can expect for the year to come, because that's what they need to know to do their jobs. But it's clear to me at this point that no matter who I'm speaking to, we all operate in the same ecosystem of housing, and we're all sort of facing the same sort of challenges. So with that in mind, I put together a slideshow that's the same things that I've been saying for 6 and 7 years. Basically, 5 years ago was, why are prices going to go up? Because of these reasons. 3 years ago, why are prices going up so much? These reasons. And recently, why are we in a housing affordability crisis? Same reasons. So with that, I think I'll just jump into my slideshow and show you all some slides. I'm not a political person. I don't have an opinion about any of this. I'm not optimistic and I'm not pessimistic. I'm just giving you the lay of the land that you are going to be operating in 2024 based on the data that's out there. We are a data provider at CREA. We actually distribute data that gets widely publicized. You read about what the housing market's doing. If you read about home prices, that comes from my team. But I'm going to talk less about that and more about just the overarching demand supply situation, how much housing demand there is out there, and what supply we have to fulfill that. Obviously, everyone knows at this point there's not enough supply, and that's the root of the problem. But I'm going to dig into some details. So with that said, let me start. And can I get a thumbs up there? Everything looks good? Yeah? I'm going to assume yes. Okay, so the first chart I'm going to show you is a chart of estimated population of planet Earth from 12,000 years ago to today. And it's funny on a chart, 12,000 years ago it's logarithmic, but if you look up until about 1950, it didn't really do a whole heck of a lot. And then it did the old hockey stick. So that is a dramatic chart. Everyone needs to live somewhere. This is housing demand, right? And so this was always coming at us. This was always going to be an issue. We've been able to deal with it thus far reasonably well. But, at some point you run out of room. And the problem is all these people that were sort of popped up in the second half of the 20th century are all occupying space right now, and they're still around. So for the new entrants into the space, it's become a big challenge. That's my first slide. What does that look like in Canada? So this is the population of Canada broken out as a histogram by age group. So 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, etc. In 5-year increments. And this is what it looked like 50 years ago. Half the population was under 30. And so when you think about housing demand, that's typically what's known technically in the parlance of the you know, people that deal with this sort of thing is headship rates, meaning you're the head of your own household. You don't live with your parents, you don't live with roommates, you don't live in assisted living. You have your own place, basically, right? And that's typically 30 to 85. Those goalposts may be moving over time, but for our purposes today, this will do. So you can see that half the population 50 years ago was under 30, right? And so all of those kids that sprung up, that big population growth in the 1950s and 60s, they were just shoved into existing bedrooms in existing homes. It didn't require the kind of new home construction that the population growth we have today does. So it's not really comparable. But one of the things I find interesting to do with this kind of data is to take the time dimension out of the chart and to put it into an animation. So if I animate this, I'm going to just do that now. There's the 80s. Here come the baby boomers, Gen X, and then me. That's me buying my house. I'm the tail end of Gen X and the first of Gen Z. You can see that the distribution of population in that middle age area has changed dramatically. That's called a secular trend. So I'm going to talk about cyclical trends in a moment. When it comes to housing, it is cyclical. It goes up, it goes down over time. This is something that is only moving in one direction. This is happening all around the world. And the only country in the world that is trying to fix it via immigration, in other words, bringing enough working age people at the sort of in that 20 to 40 range, is Canada. And we have the strongest population growth and immigration policy in the world. In order to solve this demographic conundrum that is facing most countries in the world in the next coming decades. So immigration is a good thing. Canada has the ability to attract people, to be able to, you can turn on the tap and nothing comes out. In this case, we're able to bring people in, but it does create, obviously, stresses on existing systems, housing, healthcare, all the rest of it. But the bottom line here is that this is what the demographic profile looks like. It's only going to continue to move in that direction. So again, a secular trend. In our lifetimes, this is only going in one direction. We're not going to go back to being a young country again. That's not going to happen. And nor is it going to happen for any other country. So if you look at the number of people moving from their 20s to their 30s, which is your typical sort of first-time home buyer, like I'm going to, go out on my own kind of age range. You can move that line around a little bit if you want, but the story's the same. You can see that the inflow of that is actually higher than the younger baby boomers, who were for a long time the top of the podium for the biggest population group. Now it's these millennials and Gen Z, but there's also 2.5 times as many of them in terms of the length, right? So we're 25 years of population growth or household formation growth coming from this group that already is here, not future people, already is here. We're only halfway through that, and we got a long way to go. Meanwhile, the people that are heading out of that home ownership age range, where you typically might divest of your home to move into, with relatives or communal living or whatever it is, or maybe off this mortal coil altogether, is still very much lower than the inflow of new households. So we've had to be building like crazy, and we haven't been doing that. And I think we all know that, but this is just to sort of illustrate that. And one of the reasons I've been showing this chart for years is because I always knew that eventually the boogeyman for our housing problems would move from foreign buyers to speculation to money laundering to vacant houses to immigration. And I knew it would get ugly, and it feels like that we're there today. But let me show you now. Obviously, this chart has not been updated for 2023. Those numbers came out a few months ago. I haven't gotten there yet. So let me just show you what population growth in 2023 looks like compared to everything back to World War II. You ready? Watch this. Oh, sorry. This isn't the right one. So anyway, the point here is that this is going to continue on for some decades. Okay, population growth. That is an off the chart chart. So this is quarterly population estimates by StatCan. And it's the year-over-year change. The most recent one that just came out 2 weeks ago, 1.25 million people in 1 year. So a normal year going back to the middle of the 20th century would have been 200 to 400, maybe 300 on average. 1.25 million. It was 430,000 people in 1 quarter, which is more than we would have seen in a year, in most years in the last half century, in the space of 3 months. So this is where this conversation has sort of blown up. For a while, we were talking about immigration. I do media all the time, and I get questions about, to what extent is immigration, international immigration, affecting this? I say, well, be careful. It's not about immigration, because when we talk about that, it's, we had targets of 475,000 people. Now it's going to be increased to 500, but it's going to stay at 500. It's not going to go above 500, right? So let me show you what 500 looks like on this chart. That's 500. So we're having the wrong conversation. It's only recently, like 2 weeks ago, I think it was, they lined up all of the chief economists of all the big banks in Canada at the Economic Club of Canada, which is a terrifying stage to be on, by the way. And they went down the line. They must have had a meeting beforehand, and they all were saying this is out of control. And I saw the article that it's actually a reporter at Bloomberg that I know that wrote up about that meeting, and I was like, "Whoa, man!" It's like they're all on side. It's like all of a sudden this is a huge problem because people have been a little bit, careful around the subject of immigration, because, as I've just shown you, it's very necessary. And Canada is the only country that has a chance in hell of solving this problem by immigration. But I think people are maybe sounding the alarm that it's possible we turn the knob up to 11 a little bit too fast. And certainly in the last year, that's what it's looking like. And so we've been talking about 500,000 a year. What we're not talking about is this other 750, which is really 60% of the population growth, which is the part that the immigration minister, Mark Miller, had said last week is, quote, out of control. And you probably saw that yesterday that they had announced that there's going to be some curbs on international students, and they're going to try to sort of put this back down. My point for what I normally do, which is forecasting the resale housing market, but also in the space that you operate in, which is all the same housing continuum. This demand for a roof over your head in a country where it goes to minus 30 is already here. So this is something you need to take into consideration in terms of the lay of the land going into 2024, is that this has already happened. So we'll leave population there. Just say everyone needs to live somewhere. We have record household formation. It's not record in terms of level. It was pretty high when the younger baby boomers were coming through in the 80s, which was the first housing boom in Canada, by the way. It's that high again, but it's going to go on for like decades. But we also have very acute, sharp record population growth, and it's all happening right now at the same time. In terms of housing demand for anywhere on the spectrum of housing, right, on that continuum, whether it's the ownership space, the rental market, the non-market housing options that your organization deals primarily with, or People that are increasingly dealing with being unhoused or unsheltered, which is also was an obvious, thing that was going to come about from this sort of crisis. I don't see it getting better in 2024, not to be a pessimist. Now, the question is, what are we building? We need to be building. So we know these people are here. We know the demand is there. What are we building? So this is a stacked area chart of housing unit completions for all of Canada. It goes back to 1990. It used to go back to 70. CMHC decided to truncate that series for some reason in the middle of a housing crisis. I'm not sure why. So this is what we got. We got 30 plus years of data. And you can see that if you look at the overall number of units, it's a record. Something like 250,000 a year, which is okay. But at the same time, the difference between this go round and previous housing booms is it's all apartments. So these are all condos and purpose-built apartments, which are not, I was talking to a guy from London yesterday. These are not European style flats you can raise a family in. Okay. These are small. They're not suitable replacements for these single detached homes that we stopped building 20 years ago. So we were supposed to be building the missing middle. I guess I'll get to that in a minute. Sorry. And I know that was in the title of this webinar, the missing middle. That's what's still missing. What's really crazy for me, having done all these speaking engagements and you do the Q&A and people will say like, well, we can't just build for the market. We need to focus on rentals. And that was true. There was a lack of that in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. But if you look at this, I'm going to put another layer on here. That's purpose-built rental apartments. So in the last 10 years, that's, at CREA, we've been advocating that we need more of everything. So we're not picking and choosing. We're saying housing, we need more of everything. What's actually blowing up or really increasing in terms of completions? Purpose-built rentals. 34% of completions in the most recent data that I have here. I think it's from the end of last year. You can see that's been building for a decade, certainly in the last 5 years, to the point that it's more than condos and it's more than single detached homes in terms of the units that are coming out. And that's great. And that's a very attainable thing. I don't think that's suitable long-term necessarily for people that are looking to grow families for more than 2 people. If you want to have a kid or 2, 1-bedroom apartment's not going to cut it. So if you look at what is out, what we're producing into the housing stock that can be owned by people, and bear in mind, and I know that this isn't necessarily the main clientele of people on this webinar, but if you ask young people, if you ask new Canadians, what are your aspirations to become a homeowner someday? They will say, I would like to own my own home someday, in the 90% range. Okay. So if you look at what can actually be, we're producing that can be owned, that's been falling for 20 years. If you take out the condos and look at what can be owned that you can actually, with enough sort of, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, like you maybe not a huge yard if it's a row home or something, but something you can raise a family in. That's been falling for 20 years, and it's like less than 40% of completions, even though we've got this massive demand for this. Why people are moving from Ontario to Alberta. They're doing it because that's where they can buy a home. So it's really wild to see. It used to be crazy to think that people would move all the way out to Guelph because it was a 40-minute drive back to Toronto. And now they're moving to Edmonton. And after Edmonton, you've got Saskatoon, Regina, Winnipeg, maybe Thunder Bay, and then people are going to start moving down to the United States. So that's the sort of the nature of the housing crisis here in Canada. I know that in the title, I was asked to speak about the missing middle. So that's the missing middle there. You can see why it's called a missing middle, because it's still missing, even though we've been talking about it and everyone's sort of nodding their heads at these conferences for the last sort of 10 years. Like, yeah, that's exactly what we should be building. And what I've heard from developers and realtors is that, and from my economics background, I look at this and I go, well, that's just obviously the least profitable thing to be building. Otherwise, there'd be more of it. So we transitioned right from detached homes, big traditional single detached homes on big pieces of land, to high-rise apartments, right through that missing middle, all the while talking about it, but not building much of it at all. And it's funny because if you think about the current situation we're in, it's hard to qualify for a mortgage. Housing is very expensive. Interest rates are high. But people are growing their families. There's a lot of young millennial people in their 30s and into their 40s. So what would make the most sense from an attainability standpoint would be, and I put an arrow there, and my colleague Dill said, can you change the color? Because you almost can't even see it, but that's the point. This is purpose-built row homes, purpose-built rental row homes. I grew up in a row home development in West End, Ottawa, from age 2 to age 12. And it was great. It was a great option for my mom lost her job and they had to move, they had to sell her home, and they rented this place, and we had a pool and, basketball courts, and the kids could go anywhere. There's no cars, right? Because the parking lots all come in from the outside. It was a great option. But at the same time, I went to school and I was called poor because my parents didn't own their own home. So there's that stigma too, which again, like, could be alleviated by a larger sort of critical mass of rental accommodations that's just where people live. We're not there yet in Canada, but certainly just pointing out that, I have some experience with this, and that if ever there was a missing middle in terms of the ownership tenure between ownership and non-market being in the rental space, and also big enough to raise a family in without having to be a giant home, it would be a purpose-built rental row home, which we are building exactly 0 of. So I'm going to move on from the new construction side of things. So we've covered demand, we've covered what we're building, and talking about units, but units of what? Not in a lot of cases what would suit, what it would be suitable for people that have this housing need, whether core or otherwise. So what happens is they absorb inventory out of the existing home market. And that's where we get into our data here at CREA. So this is the overall number of listings on the market. So if you go on our website, realtor.ca, you can see all the pins on the map that you can sort of choose from that are up for sale at any given point in time. This is that series over about 7 years, about a quarter century, which is enough to capture one full housing cycle. And housing is cyclical. It tends to cycle about every 20 years or so, 18, 20 years. And so you can see from the previous low in about 2002, all the way up and over and back down to where we are today is 20 years. And we are still down here. Yes, it was lower during COVID. Everyone bought up everything that was available during COVID. That was a bit of a special case, but we're not going back up to this situation with a lot of inventory. We're actually still in that situation of very limited supply. So let me just walk you through, as an analyst of this data, what we look at. So we saw this coming, starting about 2015. The price of oil crashed. The Canadian dollar went from parity with the US dollar to about 70 something cents, which means that Alberta's going to do not so great, but the rest of the country is going to do really great because we export things. We're the store that sells things to the US, and it was a 30% off sale, right? And so we saw this start up. The government introduced the stress test, which put it on pause. And everyone, a lot of our members did say, oh, the market's dead in the water. And really, it was just a long-term trend that was just set on pause for a couple of years. All of that happened before COVID even started. We were ready to declare a national seller's market for the first time in 18 years. And then COVID hit, and I had to change my quote in our news release to be like, who knows what's going to happen? We had a little blip when COVID happened for about 2 months. People thought, oh my God, the housing market. And it turned out everyone wanted housing during COVID. And we got all the way down to the lowest inventory of all time. So imagine 40 million people, the largest housing stock of all time in Canada. And this thing, the number of those things for sale was the lowest it had been on record. We have records going back to 1980, never been that low, which is pretty crazy. So yes, we popped up to here. It looks like it's going to stop there. That is still historically, compared to the population and housing stock, very low. So you divide this number by the number of sales that are happening, which is also still below average. And it looks like this. Oh, sorry. Let me back that truck up a little bit. So for me, this is the overarching trend. It's not the little ups and downs. It's where we are in this sort of decade-long cycle. So you divide by sales, you get something we call the number of months of inventory. It's typically used for in factories. If you got like shelf loads of inventory, how many months of inventory do we have? We keep selling them at this rate. When will we run out? When do we start the factory back up? But it's useful. It's a sort of an understandable way to understand housing as well. If sales continue to go the way they're going, how many months of inventory do we have till we run out, sort of thing. So, and where we are right now is under 4. Long run average is 5. So we measure a buyer's market as 1 standard deviation above that long-term average. Seller's market is being 1 standard deviation below. And we are basically hovering around what would traditionally be a normal, pretty aggressive seller's market right now. Yes, it's not as low as it was during COVID, which was crazy. We're not expecting 30% price growth again this year. But we're also not expecting prices to go down if a whole horde of people come flying off the sidelines who have been waiting. So this is people who have been pent up before this, pent up during the inflation crisis, stuck in the rental market. New Canadians, 1.25 million of them, all sort of a coiled spring waiting to explode right now. And it's just the market hasn't sort of started up yet this year, but we're close. And they're going to come into a market that still has a major inventory shortage, that's still effectively a seller's market. And so, the risk here from a forecasting standpoint is that, it's going to go back to being effectively, you show up to bid on a house and there's 5 other people that also want it. So that's not our official forecast, but I do suspect that's going to happen this year. And again, like the cyclical part of it, you can see way up, over, and back down, that we're not even started to climb out of this thing yet, and the market's about to explode. So prices obviously holding on pretty well. This is our MLS home price index. For those who don't know, the best measure of home prices in the world. This goes down to every neighborhood and property type level in Canada. So like my house that I'm in right now in my neighborhood has an index that all builds up to this national series. That's why it looks so smooth. With our partners at Altus Group and our partners at StatCan for the seasonal adjustment portion. And this is actually the official Canada price index for the Bank of Canada, Bank for International Settlements, and IMF, just to brag a little bit here. So you can see, like, obviously we peaked a couple of years ago before rates started to go up, bottomed out. Last spring, there was a bit of a, hey, like, what's going on here? I think was a good indicator of what we could expect this year, which is going to be even more. And the Bank of Canada isn't going to raise rates anymore. A bit of a fade in prices this fall. A lot of listings came out after Labor Day. I think people were expecting prices like they had seen a few months ago. Meanwhile, the buyers, after the Bank of Canada rate hikes, had gone into hibernation. So it was a lot of listings sitting around in the fall. A little bit of fade in prices because some people accepted them, like my neighbor across the street who wanted to sell. I said, well, Chris, those aren't lowball offers, man. Those are just the offers you're going to get it. You're going to sell at the worst time ever. And he did. And they came over to say goodbye the other day, which was nice. But I don't expect that to continue. It's actually those month-to-month decreases are getting smaller. I think it's going to bottom out. I think it's going to take off again this spring. That's not our official forecast. That's the risk because there is so much demand out there. And so why do I think people are going to flood up the sidelines? Well, let's talk about interest rates. So here's the Bank of Canada's key rate in blue. And the most recent forecast, which is this morning? From my colleague Ryan, which he got off our Bloomberg terminal. So the first sort of year of that is what bond markets are actually expecting. And then the next couple of years is a survey based. They link it all together and you get a forecast for interest rates. And, looking out a couple of years, it looks like we're going to get back to pretty normal. The Bank of Canada's neutral or normal range, which means they don't have their foot on the gas or the brake. It's sort of coasting, is 2 to 3%. So we'll call it 2.5, which is basically halfway between where we are now and where we were at the lowest levels of COVID. Of course, looking back on this chart, was COVID really that low? It's kind of the 20 teens were kind of all in that range too. So it doesn't look like we're going back to those levels, but it does look like we're going back to quite a bit lower than where we are today, and soon, because the biggest change in this rate curve in the last sort of 2 months has been the 2024 portion. So it's like if you're a skier, you can think of it as the drop in. That steep initial drop in rates, which is expected to go somewhere around April. This curve actually looked quite a bit different 2 weeks ago. It was steeper. It was like 6 cuts this year. So 150 basis points starting in April. Now it's kind of like maybe April and maybe 4 cuts. So it's raising back up. And that just reflects the fact that the Bank of Canada was not too happy with markets anticipating that level of rate cuts. They were like, whoa. Don't get ahead of yourselves here, people. So I think this is probably more realistic as far as what we're going to see. But either way, I think that there's a lot of buyers that are saying, we want to buy a house. We want to make sure that the Bank of Canada isn't going to raise rates again and put us on the street. If this is to whatever degree that curve looks like, if it's definitely going down, it's going down fast starting tomorrow, we're all in. And so the bank is worried that the risk that I identified, that the market will be as strong as it will this spring, will happen. So they're going to do their best to sort of keep people on the sidelines through April, through May, through June, hopefully, and spread that out so that it doesn't really explode. I think they've got an announcement tomorrow morning. So you can go and it's not about what they do, but what they say. And they've got another one in March where they're going to reinforce that messaging. And then we'll see what happens in April. But this is coming one way or the other. But it's just a matter of the timing about whether it really blows up in 2024 or it gets pushed off into 2025, which the Bank of Canada would prefer because it won't has less of a risk of derailing their inflation control mandate. All right. So what's next? Well, obviously, this was easy to predict. that, you know, when rates go through the roof and people are priced out of the ownership housing market, that rent would go through the roof. And so this is average rents, all types of, for all of Canada, from rentals.ca. And you can see that from about the time that rates started to go up at the beginning of 2022 until the end of last year, rents in, like, on average in Canada increased by 22%. So, you know, if you're an average renter, you might have had a rent of $1,800, uh, you know, starting 2022. And then for all of 2022, you were paying 2,000. And then starting in last year, you're paying 2,200. So obviously, you know, we talked about the toothpaste tube being squeezed from the ownership space into the rental space. This squeezes people from the rental space. It's not like people who are renting are going to be like, well, I guess I'll just buy a house then because this is too expensive. They get squeezed into the into your space, which is the non-market, affordable social co-op space, and unfortunately into the unhoused space and the unsheltered space. But that was all very easy to predict. I think that with you know, rates going down, we're going to see a flow back the other way. But with the demand coming in, it doesn't mean demand's going to go down in your world. It just might not go up as much. And certainly, this is not a new trend. So this is the Canadian home ownership rate from census data over 50 years. And so you can see that that was a secular trend for 40 years. But secular trends don't last forever. And in the last decade, the home ownership rate in Canada has gone down. This doesn't even account for the last 2 years of high rates and the rental market going crazy. This was happening starting in 2011. And so obviously it's if you break that out, the difference between the last 10 years, that decline in the home ownership rate is all young people. Because people like me, I still own my home. I'm not divesting of it. My parents aren't. It's just harder to get in for young Canadians and new Canadians. And so you get this weird chart like this that looks at the change in homeownership rate attainability in the last 10 years. And under 44, it's all the millennials and the first Gen Zs. They're the ones that are really suffering. So you get this weird curve that kind of looks like that. If you went back 20 years when the homeownership rate was still going up, it kind of looked like that. And then it went like this. And then it went like this, which is now. So what's it going to do going forward? Probably that. And then that. And I think that really is a good example of the inequality that is growing in the property / land ownership space between the haves and the have-nots. It wasn't so long ago that most people in the middle class did have, and that actually left a lot of leeway and capacity in the rental and non-market space to accommodate people that weren't homeowners. And so as far as everyone on this call goes, just expect more demand in the space that you operate in. And quite frankly, like, it's going to become like so many other places in the world have gone before, where, you know, the way that you acquire property is if your grandparents or parents in your family leave it to you. And you can see that there's going to be more ownership at the far end of the age range and less at this. It's just moving that direction. There's no reason to think that for everything I've shown you, that would change. That's only going to get worse before it gets better. Unfortunately, I don't mean to be a pessimist or an optimist. I'm just showing you sort of the stuff that we look at that sort of sets the lay of the land that we all have to operate in. And so with that, I'll stop my share. And I know that we, if we want to do a Q&A, I'd be happy to try to answer those.
Thank you, Sean. That was great. We have one question in the chat right now. And the question is, to what extent is the 1.2 million population growth due to the immigration backlog during the pandemic years? And do you expect this to be sustained or a short-term shock?
So that's a good question. The immigration targets, they didn't actually announce any increases to those to make up for lost time. Most of that, like 60% of that 1.25 million is international students and temporary for workers over and above the immigration target. Um, so the extent to which that's making up for lost time, I couldn't say. Um, all I know is that people's sort of eyeballs sort of bugged out when they saw that, and then the immigration minister last week said it's out of control. So um, I just look at it from a very analytical, clinical standpoint of, everyone's got to live somewhere, and that's a lot of people all of a sudden when we already had a crisis before that. So the fact that there was a bit of a divot during COVID maybe takes a little bit of pressure off, but ultimately there wasn't a lot of building going on at that point either. So um, I would just say it's difficult to parse that out. Um, I think the bigger impact will be the fact that this has now become, how would you say, um, with all of the chief economists of every big bank in Canada all saying at the same time, okay, do something about this government. And then they're like, we're going to do something. That's going to be the bigger impact going forward, as opposed to looking backward. But like I say, when it comes to housing demand, all those people are already here.
Another question that we've got is, has CREA ever modeled how rent control could impact trends that you've presented?
Can you repeat that? The rent control could impact.
Has CREA ever modeled how rent control could impact the trends you've presented?
So there's a couple schools of thought on rent control. One of the things about economics, and I'm a pretty left-leaning person, but economics tends to have a sort of a right-leaning um, element to it, just by virtue of its own nature. Kind of like nature, like, it's like, it'd be nice if that wolf didn't eat that bunny, but that's the way it goes. Uh, so with rent controls, the problem is it's kind of like it's very much like non-market housing, which is great if you can get a place for $800 a month as opposed to 1,800, but you're standing in a line with 100 other people and there's only one unit. So it does tend to restrict supply. It's a conundrum, right? That would tend to restrict supply. It's great if you can get in and you benefit from it, but it also, for the people who don't get in, it's a restrictive element on new supply coming in. And one of the great things that they're doing now, I think, is certainly when I showed you the increase in purpose-built rental apartments is great. That's something that's really been missing since the 80s, really, that we are actually doing really well now. That's the one element of supply that we're doing great at already, not just, never mind the announcements of a month ago. For the last 10 years, we've been doing pretty good at it. And that's an important element to sort of taking the pressure off in that space. But I have to appeal to my sort of economic background and say, more units is the best solution to controlling prices, not rent control, because if you've got 1.2 million people coming in, there's not enough rent control apartments for everybody, right? So it'd be better if we had enough spaces for it's more about it's the number of units more than anything else.
Another question you've got. I've seen online that average rent has declined in the last 2 months as people are leasing new properties. Do you expect it to continue to decline, or does rental demand always drop in the winter?
I'd be shocked if I, I would call it a blip. That like the demand for housing generally in all along the continuum, no matter where you are, is off the charts right now and will continue to be. So I do not expect rents to go down. It's kind of like inflation, right? When people say like, when will these grocery prices ever go back down? It's like, no, you're not understanding. Disinflation just means it's not going to go up as much. It's not going to go down. And I wouldn't expect it to go down at all, unfortunately. And like the real solution is like, look, I forgot to mention this in my presentation. Okay. So CMHC, under their former CEO, not the one that just jumped ship a month ago, the one before that, said there's no supply problem in Canada. Just rent for the rest of your life. It'll be great. And people were like, we're not sure about that. And we said we need to build more houses, more of everything. Like everything's great. It's not about differentiating, right? And so under their newer CEO, who just jumped ship, and what does that tell you about that organization? CEO jumping ship after 2 years. And if anyone's on the line from there, sorry. But they put out a number that said we need 3.5 million homes over and above what we're currently expected to build, which is overly optimistic, by the way, by 2030. 2030 is 6 years from now. So if you do the math, we're currently building 250,000 units a year, right? In order to achieve that goal, you'd have to raise that to 900,000 a year. So we can't go from 250 to 3. To get to that goal, you have to go to 9 and maintain that for the next 6 years and then going forward as well. So I don't mean to be a pessimist here, but it's a big challenge, and some secular trends will only continue to get worse, and we have to adapt. It's unfortunate that North America developed so much in the 1950s and 60s when everyone suddenly had a car, and we just spread out in our big ranch bungalows, as opposed to these European walkable cities where they had to be walkable because everyone's walking, right? So we have what we have, and we have to sort of figure out how to adapt that going forward.
The next question you have, for the declining ownership rates in young cohorts, somebody owns the rental units. To what extent is this phenomenon due to concentration of wealth, i.e. ownership, compared to expanded supply of purpose-built rentals relative to ownership supply?
That's a great question. I think it is probably concentration of wealth. Who can afford? I've often said, who can afford to buy $1 million house? Is somebody that already has $1 million house to sell or to leverage, right? Whereas if you're a young person, even just like young, I mean, I guess I'm not young, but not that much younger than me. Looking at what I did sort of 12 years ago when I bought this place, which was sort of reasonable and wasn't a crazy thing to do, today would be almost impossible. But yet someone like my parents or even me, I could leverage the wealth that I built up in this, and the wealth that I built, not by paying it off, just by having owned it through that big upswing in prices, to buy another place. And then all of a sudden like landlord, boy, talk about something that needs a rebrand. Right. But yeah, I think that it is a big, and their numbers came out of Terranet, came out of StatCan, that tons of people bought secondary and tertiary properties during the pandemic as their rates were super low and their equity in their existing properties that they could leverage went through the roof. So yeah, it is a lot of that. Unfortunately, it's growing. That was the end of my presentation, right? Is that inequality between older and younger is going to continue. And then what that eventually turns into is wealth that is contained within families passed down through generations. Go to Europe, you never sell never get rid of the land. You can build different houses on it. We're still in Canada, we're still a young country. We're like, I can't believe that's $1 million house. It's like, it's not. It's like it's a $700,000 lot with a crappy old World War II house on it. But I think that's a new thing for us here in Canada that we're just sort of wrapping our heads around now.
How do you perceive Montreal's approach to the missing middle? What are they doing better than the rest of Canada relative to this form of housing?
What is Montreal doing better? So I live there. What they're doing better is developing their city center 120 years ago in a way that's very walkable and with like Brooklyn, like walk-ups and like dense. So they're not doing anything specifically now, I wouldn't say. It's what they did in the past. And they just, got further along that path before sort of suddenly everyone had a car. And we decided that suburbs were the best thing since sliced bread. But all of that, when I lived in Montreal, all of those properties that I lived in and that I was near, I mean, we're already 100 years old at that point, right? So maybe it's just a matter of maybe more of a European style development, I guess. It definitely feels that way. Quebec City's even more so. Yeah, I mean, like even when we have our MLS home price index breaks properties down by 1-story detached, 2-story detached, row home, and apartment. But in Quebec, and specifically in Montreal, they're like, no, we have a different breakdown. They have a thing called Plex, which is like European style, like flats, which they just have more of there. That's way more of, which we have none of anywhere else in Canada. So that's what they're doing right. But they're not doing it now. They just did it in the past.
I think that's a good segue into this other question, which is, do you think that innovative types of building coming into the market could change any of this trajectory? For example, tiny homes, new tenures, more co-ops.
100%. I think that the solution is, but it's not it's not I'm going to borrow from my former CEO here. It's not my grandfather with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, banging in one nail at a time in February up on a thing. It's innovation in terms of technology. So it's panelization. You could, we're a country with tons of lumber, but it doesn't need to be softwood lumber that's milled. It could be ground up and turned into, what do they call it, glulam, like mass timber construction, panelization of pieces. So you have entire walls that are built. You just click them together, load them on trains. You can put them anywhere in Canada. Build them north in Winnipeg or something in a mega factory. Get Elon Musk to build us a gigafactory, and then you can cart them by train anywhere in North America. I think innovation is the only way we get out of this. You tack a heat pump onto it. There's no basement. There's no gas line. There's no parking space. I mean, like we need to totally rethink what housing looks like, but to make it attainable for if we're going to have a population of 50 and 60 and 70 plus million people, I think we need to rethink the way that we do it. And certainly, so my old CEO, not old, sorry, Michael, former CEO, is enjoying his retirement now, used to say, a carpenter like my grandfather from the 1940s could pop out of a time machine and start swinging a hammer on most construction sites today. It's like there's been no innovation. So if anything, there's low-hanging fruit there. There's a huge opportunity to do things more efficiently and better than we do it now. And so, yeah, there is a huge opportunity. I think it's on the innovation side, and would be. I'm not an expert on this, but you can think of it like the way they do roof trusses, right? So no one's actually yelling out measurements down to some guy on the ground sawing. They deliver them on a truck already made, right? The roof pieces. So you do that for the whole house, right? And then and then it's also about marketing, right? This isn't a what do you call it? This isn't a Kia Rio. It's a Toyota Prius. It's saving the environment. This thing's great. Like this thing I'm living in is a big old clunky SUV. That's like the house of the future. It's cool. So I think there's an opportunity there, but tiny houses on big lots is missing the point. It's about taking up less land because that's where the cost is, right? You want to make it affordable, it's got to be on less land. And so I live on a lot right here in Ottawa that could fit 6 or 8 families on it. And instead it's got my little 1958 house on it. And there's 1,200 other ones like this in my neighborhood that could, do the math, right? Multiply that by
Right.
6.
And then I think we have time for one more question. The
Sure.
last question in our chat is, do you think that the government's recent policies to increase housing, so GST cuts for construction, accelerator fund, etc., will be enough to fix the problem? Or is there anything else that should be put in place to fix the housing shortage minus slowing immigration?
So first part of the question, is that going to be enough? No, clearly not even close. Like, I mean, like I gave you the numbers, right? Like if you trust CMHC, in their contribution to this housing crisis, which is just to give us a number that's so unattainable that it might as well not even try. But I think we should try. That we'd have to increase construction from 250,000 units a year to something like 800,000 or 900,000 is ridiculous. It won't happen. What could the government do? Like they're doing what they can. One of the things that actually here at CREA, we partnered up with our provincial association in British Columbia and the other in Ontario, so BCREA and CREA, along with the Conference Board of Canada to put out a paper, which I think is published on our website, CREA.ca, which details exactly how the government can adapt our international immigration intake system, the points system, as it's known, to not favor so much, higher education and knowing English and French, but hey, can you swing a hammer? Do you know how to work with concrete? Can you lay brick? And sort of to bring in some of the skills, because really with the home building, we're sort of at a capacity of, we'd like to build all this stuff, but we don't have enough people to do it. But we're bringing in 1.2 million people. You tap into a small piece of that and you can actually get a lot of those skills. So that's one thing they could do. But are we going to solve this problem tomorrow? No, almost like there's no way you could do it, but you have to move in the right direction. And I think those are some of what the government's doing now is doing that. There are other things that they could also do that would push the needle a little bit further. But boy, it's that's a long climb.
Well, I think that's all the time that we have for today. Sean, thank you so much
Sure.
for taking the time to speak with us on such an important topic. We really appreciate you being here. There were a couple questions in the chat about if this presentation will be made public. Yes, it's been recorded. It will be shared on the CHRA's YouTube page in the next couple of days, as most of our webinars are, so you can find it there. Thank you so much again. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.